Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Nivi Sharma. I'll be moderating this session on digitalization. So the first thing I want to do is I really want to test the digitalization in this room. Can I get a show of hands of who has a smartphone in this room? Okay, keep your hands up. Keep your hands up if you have downloaded the EDD app. Keep your hands up if you have used the EDD app. Okay, so I'm really going to test this now. It looks like 80–90% of you have used the EDD app. So take your phones out. We're going to be using the EDD app throughout the session. And I'm going to ask you to answer the first audience poll question, which will be, have you downloaded the EDD app? So the way you do it is very simple. You open the app. On the home page of the application, you should see programs, speakers, network, shape the debate, and maps. So we want to click on shape the debate. Once we click on shape the debate, interactive tools. Are we all together? And once we're on interactive tools, we're clicking on voting. And we're in auditorium A2, so we click on Vote A2. Is everyone ready? Who needs a little more time? Okay. So the question is, are you digital? Did you download the EDD app on your smartphone? And it would be silly for anyone to answer no. So once you get to vote A2, ready? We're going to start voting now and click on 1. We did get 2% of people who said no. Thank you. OK, so that was a good show. So keep your phones out. Keep this voting app on hand. I'm going to ask you 3 more questions. So we're going to keep this session interactive, and we will want your participation throughout the session. So again, my name is Nivi Sharma. I'm from Nairobi, Kenya, and I work with an organization called BRIC. Our mission is to connect Africa to the internet. We provide free-to-consumer Wi-Fi across the country. And we do this with a strong belief that, personally, I firmly believe that digitalization, the infrastructure, and the policy are the foundational building blocks upon which opportunities, especially for women and youth, can be built. But we're going to discuss that. As we see more and people embracing ICT, we see more people getting online and being connected, we can't ignore the opportunities but also the challenges that digitization pose in the form of how digitalization is rolled out and how it is accessed. So I'm going to run this session in a very interactive way. I'm going to have a conversation with these wonderful panelists. There's not going to be any presentations. There's not going to be any speeches. Their remarks will be 3 to 4 minutes. Yes? And we'll leave plenty of space for discussion and dialogue with you, the audience. So during this debate, we're going to tackle 3 key thematic areas. The first will be the opportunities that digitization can bring to developing nations. The second is the challenges, barriers, fears, and risks that are involved that digitization poses. And the third is the role of digitization in shaping development policy. So after each of those sessions, you will have an opportunity to ask questions. So there'll be 3 opportunities to ask questions after opportunities, challenges, and policy. And throughout the session, I encourage you to tweet using the hashtag EDD17. And so I'll dive right in and introduce the panelists. Right next to me here is Mr. Kaim Michel Sabag. He's the president and CEO of SES, the world's leading satellite operator. So his unique views from the private sector will be very insightful for this panel. Next to him, we have Ms. Chinenye Ezeakor from Nigeria. She's the founder of A System, an organization that does outreach to encourage young girls to enroll in STEM. STEM is science, technology, engineering, and maths. Then we have Mr. Andras Ansip, the VP of the Digital Single Market at the European Commission, and he also used to be the Prime Minister of Estonia. We're very honored to have him here, as he was personally involved in the Commission staff working document Digital for Development, a very important document if any of you are involved in policy and using digitization in policy to read. And it's a framework for mainstreaming how digital technologies can be incorporated in policy. And next to him, we have Her Excellency Dr. Amani Abu Zaid, the Commissioner for Infrastructure and Energy at the Africa Union Commission. She is in charge of the sectors at the AU covering energy, transport, tourism, and ICT. We also will be having a fifth panelist. His tardiness has been excused because he's having lunch with the Queen of Belgium, who, as you know, is an SDG ambassador. So Mr. Alexander De Croo will be joining us. He's the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Development, Cooperation, Digital Agenda, Telecom, and Postal Services for Belgium. Okay, so let's dive into it. Again, get your phone ready. We're going to start with you, the audience, before we turn to our panelists. I have the first question of the day for you, which is digitization good? Is it good for all countries, or is it good only for democracies? Let's get a feel of the room. Are you ready? Okay, the 15 seconds to answer your question. So that's interesting that almost 15% of people in this room think digitization is good only for democracies. Okay. So now we know today that there are more households in developing countries that have a mobile phone compared to those that have access to electricity or clean water, 8 out of 10 on average. Mr. Ansip, I'll start with you. This is a huge opportunity that digitization poses. What are the opportunities that it can play in developing countries?
Yeah, I would like to also respond to this question. As we know, cars, they can be really beneficial for our people, but some people, they can kill other people using cars. So internet is also a digital solution, so they also like some instruments. And hopefully digitization will support democratic developments in all the countries, in democratic countries and less democratic countries. So if people, they will get more information, then decision-making in this country will be more transparent. Those internet-based solutions, they are also about efficiency, and it's beneficial in all the countries. We know that in Africa, in many countries, they made this real leapfrog already. When talking about mobile penetration, then now it's higher than 80% as average in African continent. And it's extremely beneficial for all the African countries. I myself, I would like to promote e-government solutions. And we can see how those governmental solutions, they were really beneficial also in developing countries. I just visited this year Nigeria, and I met with a guy who created a software solution to the government which allows to compare information through different databases, population register and register of civil servants. And investing quite small amount of money, I don't remember exactly how much, 10 million, 30 million, something like this. They were able to figure out that they had 63,000 coast workers. It means that they were able to save $1 billion a year. I think those digital investments, they can be really profitable investments, even when talking about governmental sector investments. So just a year ago, I was here, and then that I said that in every development project, there has to be also a digital component. As we know, the EU is the biggest donator when talking about development aid, together with member states, 82 billion years, but only a very small amount of money from this is going on digital, just 500 million within the 10 years. Yeah? So let's say almost nothing. Now, I'm happy to say that, as you mentioned, we agreed in this tough working document already, digital for development. Nobody's able to understand about stuff working documents, but this is a policy document. And now the whole Commission is working on basis of this document, and it means in all those development projects there has to be also a digital component, and I believe it will be really useful for all African countries also.
Mr. Sabag, I'm sure you also have some things you'd like to share with us about the opportunities you've seen digitalization unlocking for people on the ground, but also perhaps some barriers and market failures to unlocking those opportunities. Who are the unconnected, and why are they still unconnected?
As a general observation, I think the opportunity before us is connecting a continent, and we could do that. We could do that day in, day out as Société Européenne des Satellites, SES. We have around 22 satellites that are deployed over Africa and can reach each and every person on the continent. And before we get to digitization, it's first and foremost about connectivity, being able to connect point A to point B, person Y to person Z, so that they can exchange. They can exchange a conversation, they exchange data, they can exchange services. And we can do that. It is within our reach. And when I say our, is not just SES, is our reach as private sector operator and the public sector. And so to give you an order of magnitude what this represents, this is close to $5 billion of investment of infrastructure that is exclusively out there to provide connectivity. And in fact, my colleague, Steve Koller, who sits right in the front, has this as his mission in life. His job, his mission, his passion, your calling, Steve, is to ensure that we can provide these services. Now, why this is important? Because once we have the connectivity, then we can move to digitization. And our thesis is that whether it's about a bank, a retail network, a government agency, more than 50% of the business processes are digitized. And if they're not already, they are going to be digitized. Any innovation that takes place, a better way of providing a service, a better technology, more than 80% of that innovation has digitization embedded in it. This is why it matters. And we can provide this. In fact, this morning, SES announced an agreement with the government of Burkina Faso, whereby we are now connecting 13 provinces with the government to ensure that we can provide e-government services, education services, health-related services, and so on and so forth. And when all is said and done, why it matters is beyond what we can provide as a private sector with the public sector is the economic multiplier that we can create. And I was reviewing this morning the report that Minister Fioraso published last year. So she was commissioned by Prime Minister Val to study the impact and the importance of the satellite industry, the space industry in Europe and globally. And one of the very interesting findings is the following. For every dollar invested in space, there are $33 that are generated economically through services on the ground. And that is not exclusive to Europe. That, for me, is the impact we can create, again, by providing connectivity. Think of it again. $1 in space generates $33 on Earth in terms of economic generator. So it really matters. Now, what needs to happen is, first and foremost, market access. And I do concede that putting satellite in space is easier than accessing markets on our planets. It's a bit counterintuitive to go 36,000 kilometers into space than just to travel 2 hours and have market access, but it is what it is. I think the second one is to make sure that there are business-friendly policies and regulation that would allow us to sort of fulfill our mission, fulfill our calling. And I say this because there could be a perception that the private sector is just has an agenda to serve its own interests. And that is not right. At the end of the day, we answer shareholders for whom both the economic value add, but also the social value add are important. The Luxembourg government owns 66.6% of the share of capital of SES. And this is not a question that is an insignificant one whenever I have to answer the shareholders. So it is our mission to make an impact, to make a difference. Sometimes I call Steve, and the first question I ask him is, did you start saving lives? That's the way we start. We don't start with, where did we get the revenues? We start with this. Did you start making impact on societies and economies? And the third parameter is, there are going to be a number of areas where neither the private sector nor the public sector can do the job. They will have to team up together. And I'm delighted to hear about digital development, the policy that was, sorry, I sort of tried to note it, digital for development, correct? And I think this will be hopefully a good starting point to come up with public-private partnerships, because we don't have all the answers and public agencies don't have the answer. There is, I think, a space of intersection between us, a room, and we have to come up with these playbooks. And I do concede that we had a tendency to treat this as a binary question, and it should not be a binary question. What we just announced with Burkina this morning, with Burkina Faso, is a case in point. It took almost 2 years for SES and the stakeholders to sort of figure it out, but we sort of made it happen at the end of the day.
Okay. And our young leader on the panel, Ms. Chinyenye, what do you see on the ground? What opportunities are you unlocking for the girls that you work with in Nigeria? What inspired you to start a system?
Okay. Presently, technology is more than 50% of the world don't have access to internet, don't have internet access. And we live in a fourth industrial revolution where technology controls basically everything we do now. And it's been estimated that in the next 5-10 years, more than 50% of job opportunities, even presently, are IT-related. How can we get girls involved? In a situation where more than all the jobs are going to be tech-related, and we have the girls being left aside, how do we bring development to our countries? This is one of the reasons why I started a system. I'm an engineer, and I want to see more girls play a role in the science, technology, engineering, and math. We all know that more than 90% of a woman's income goes back into her family. If a woman is digitally educated, she's going to be able to earn more. If she earns more, more goes back into her family. If more goes back into our family, more goes into the economy. We need economic development in our nations. We're talking about the 2030 agenda. How do we achieve this if we do not bring the developing nations along? This is why I push for education, technology education. Also, one of the work I do, because I also work with Microsoft presently, is the Microsoft Imagine Academy, which is taking digital technologies to schools, getting kids to be digitally literate, getting them to acquire digital skills. And apart from girls, I'm also very interested with the youths, because the youths presently make up more than 50% of our population. If we do not engage the youths digitally, how do we get them to join this workforce? Technology brings about employment. Technology brings about job opportunities. If we do not get the youths involved and girls involved, we can't achieve technological advancements. So this is one of the reasons why I do what I do.
So I'm going to challenge you a little bit and ask you again, of the youth that we're getting connected, that we're putting digitization in the hands of, how many of them are actually using that as a tool to unlock opportunities for growth and job creation? Or are they looking at Facebook, WhatsApp, and maybe some sports betting sites? You know, what are the dangers there in terms of the youth actually using these tools that organizations like SES are putting so much money and investment towards in unlocking the unconnected?
So presently, we have e-commerce growing rapidly, and I'll speak for my country, Nigeria. E-commerce is one of the leading inputs into our GDP, because a lot of people now are buying goods online. Youths, in fact, when I was in school, I had an online business. I used to sell, sell some clothing materials through mobile, using mobile technologies. This is bringing about entrepreneurship. A lot of times people think when it comes to technology, the youth all just want to, you know, talk with your friends and just have fun. But no, if you look at the startups in Nigeria, a lot of them now are digitally inclined. We have a lot of people going into agriculture, being able to get rural farmers, get access to rural farmers, and have them bring their goods to the urban areas. We have it in terms of in the fashion industry. We have it in the education industry. Schools are trying to go digital. These are some of the things I'm seeing presently using technology.
Okay. Before we open up to any questions, any more reactions or further questions from the panelists? Okay. Oh, yes.
It's a comment rather than question, and I'm really happy to be here on for so many reasons. Happy to hear from our young leader here about what's happening in Africa, and which I think makes us all think of Africa differently, because it's no longer portrayed as the hopeless continent, rather than the young, vibrant, IT-savvy continent with youth like her, bridging the gap and leaping forward. So I'm really, really happy and honored to be on the same panel as her and everybody else.
Okay. Now it's your turn. Questions from the audience. So please raise your hand and someone will come to you with a mic. When you do ask a question, please be brief so we can take as many questions as possible. Try to say your name and organization if you want. If possible, again, direct your question towards a specific panelist. We also welcome comments that share your experiences or something that you've learned as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be a question. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Fulvio Sansone from SAT ADSL. We are a satellite service provider serving sub-Saharan Africa. We are one of the customers of SES, among others. We provide connectivity to people, and we can also empower local companies because we work in partnership with local companies. Now, to jump on one of the comments that was done by Mr. Sabag about market access, I just bring you an experience on the field. A few years ago, I went to one of the countries in Central Africa, where we wanted to set up, together with the local partner, a project for providing connectivity to rural hospitals. The project was perfect. The only problem was that we had to pay for each dish a tax which was 10 times the subscription fee that we were charging to the end users. We didn't manage to save any life.
Any other questions or comments in the front here?
Question en français, c'est possible. Donc, je suis Mohamedou Diallo, donc, directeur de la publication de CIO Mag, un magazine panafricain dédié au digital. Donc ma question s'adresse à monsieur de la Commission européenne, qui a dit que les projets, donc, tous les projets de l'Union européenne donc, comportent un composant digital. Pourquoi vous avez attendu tout ce temps-là pour vous intéresser au digital? Pourquoi vous ne l'avez pas fait plus tôt? Et concernant madame, pour le Nigeria, comment ces projets se matérialisent pour les filles? Vous les aidez à monter des sites internet, vous les aidez à faire de l'e-commerce. Comment vous assistez aux femmes pour donc, ce volet digital? Merci.
Sure, please.
I think the first question is for the commissioner in relation as to, and I'll try to do my best to translate it, what took so long. to introduce
Yes,
digital to development?
I got this question. It's second year for me to act as commissioner, and with me it happened also by accident that I started to pay attention on those digital developments in Africa. As you know, I'm responsible for digital single market in the European Union, which does not exist. Instead to have huge single market with 500 million healthy customers, we have in fact 28 relatively small markets. I have to create, or we have to create this digital single market in the European Union. But last year I took part in this African Union Summit, African Union Commission and European Commission meeting in Addis Abeba, and when we were talking about survival issues, about drinking water, about food, about roads, about democracy, then people, they were not so keen, sorry for this, to take part in those debates. But when we started to talk about digital issues, then there was a real interest. And I can understand about this interest because everybody is dreaming, especially in developing countries, about having leapfrog, about jumping over some kind of historical period. I'm coming from Estonia, and it was possible to jump over some historical period, also thanks to digital in my country. If it's possible, was possible in my country, why not in other countries? So we started to discuss about those issues, and now it's reality. We have our strategy paper. There has to be digital component in all those development projects. But this is one of those aspects. But I think there has to be some readiness also coming from those developing countries. And maybe they were not so much ready for that kind of cooperation. And maybe in the European Union, they thought also that African people, they are not so much ready. So in Nigeria, for example, e-commerce, Jumia, great company, acting in 14 countries. Sorry to say, but Amazon is not acting in those countries. No place for Amazon because Jumia is providing really good service with affordable prices, and it's not just a cash to delivery service, but cash on delivery, but this is also about mobile wallet. This is about online tourist agency services, and so on. So in many areas, we can see in African countries a lot of creativity, lot of really promising startups. And I think now both sides, EU and Africa, they are ready for this cooperation. So, of course, it's easy to say that we had to start earlier, but there we are. And now we have to push on this cooperation.
Before I asked Ms. Chinyenye to answer her question, do you want to react, Her Excellency?
Yes, I would very much like to react to what Vice President Ansip just said. It's not just about the reaction, but it's also about the reality. I very much appreciate what he said, but this was also the subject of another bilateral discussion he and I had previously. Africa is 55 countries. And I would like to, as they say in French, relativiser. So just, things are relative. We have fantastic examples in Africa for digitalization and ICT, adoption of ICT in development and in policies. We have here present the president of Rwanda, which is again one of the leading countries in Africa for digitalization. We have l'Île Maurice, Kenya, Senegal, other examples. So it really depends where you are and which sector you're talking about. That said, Africa, yes, is not only leapfrogging. I'm going to use the expression that I heard in Estonia only a week ago. it's tidal leap rather than just leapfrogging. So it's a tidal leap. So that's why it was important to make this intervention. I would also like to say something else. Again, I was hearing, listening very carefully to what Mr. Sabah was saying, and also to his friend here. And we're very happy that we have a representative of private sector on the panel. Why? Because we're talking about Africa, the 55 countries I just mentioned. That's the home of the next 1 billion persons who are going to be online. So just imagine the opportunity this is for the private sector and for businesses. Imagine, I mean, the sectors we will be able to cross and to tidal leap in the next few years. So again, it's very important that we have, and we think of Africa as really the digital frontier and the real investment opportunity for private sector and other, of course, other operator stakeholders.
Ms. Chinenya?
When it comes to how I help girls in digitalization, I was able to identify that the root cause of women not getting into STEM is because of lack of interest. And this can be, like say, blamed on the education system. Back home, we are used to the theoretical form of learning. So you practice science, you hear about these things, but you don't practicalize it hands-on. I thought about this and decided, why not introduce an approach whereby girls are able to learn with hands-on. So you learn about, say, Newton's law or an Archimedes principle, series connection or anything, and you practicalize it with simple materials you can find in your environment. For example, I taught some schoolgirls how to build a wind turbine using wood, cardboard, straws. They're able to think. It gets them thinking, or using softwares like maybe Scratch animation to learn how to code. And you see a lot of times, sorry, please, a lot of times when these girls have this experience, you teach them how to code now, and you come back like a week later, you see them coming up with new ideas. Kids are very excited about things like this. So I found out the way to get them to get interested in science, digitalization, is to get them to practicalize it hands-on. Another approach I use is the approach of mentorship. So I have a group of us who are females in STEM, and we once in a while organize programs where we get these girls to ask us questions, or we provide educational resources to them. Hence, my approach is hands-on training and STEM. A lot of women don't have role models in the science, technology, engineering, and math fields. Hence, they don't have who to look up to. They don't have the Albert Einstein, and so to refer back to. But if you come as a young lady, if you come as a woman who is in STEM, and you tell them, yes, this is achievable, this is something you need, this is how it's improving my life, you see a lot of young girls moving into the STEM field. So this is how I do it. Thank you.
Okay. So we're going to move into the next sequence of the session, but there will be an opportunity for more questions after it. So this session will be about challenges, fears, and risks. Again, we're going to start with you, the audience, so get your phones out. We'll start with an interactive poll from you, and I have a question for you. That question is, can digitization create employment? So the first option is no, it does not create jobs. The second is yes, but only for young people. And the third is yes for young and older people. So cast your votes. Okay, so that's a resounding yes for young and old people. But it's interesting to see that about 10% of the people in this room think that digitalization can only create jobs for young people. And almost 5% say that it does not create jobs. Perhaps it's even taking jobs away. Before we get to a reaction to that particular poll question, which is quite surprising even to me, I'd like to ask Mr. Ansip, what are the risks of the digital divides we see? Now, Mr. Sabag had said to us that the investment he's made, his technology can reach every person on the continent of Africa. And yet not every person on the continent of Africa is connected. They say 84% of the global population is connected, but only 67% of the urban population is connected. So what are the risks we see here between the connected and the unconnected, the divides between the rural and the urban?
I think those threats, they are very similar in European continent, coming from digital divide, and in African continent. We have digital divide also between elderly people and young people, urban areas and then rural areas. Yeah, those problems they are deep in African continent. But generally speaking, I'm looking forward, hopefully. Of course, we have to deal with this digital divide. We have to pay much more attention on connectivity and affordable connectivity. But I believe, as people here in this room believe, digitalization will create jobs for both for young people and older people. I know, once again, from my own country, how beneficial digitalization can be for elderly people, for example. So when banks in Estonia, when we regained independence, started to act as commercial banks once again, they didn't have any valuable memories about traditional banking, about checkbooks, etc. They just took the best technology, and when they started with internet banking system, those bank transactions via the internet that were free of charge, and if you don't have to pay, you have to take it. And this is a reason, or one of those reasons, why those elderly people in Estonia are so familiar with computers. And if people they have some experience about really user-friendly solutions, efficient solutions, then they would like to ask for that kind of solutions from other state institutions, from private sector, and then it's beneficial for everybody. Of course, I can understand about those people who are afraid about losing their jobs. People, they have a right to be afraid because of digitization, because of artificial intelligence, because of robots. But progress always created more jobs than progress used to destroy. We know those figures coming from history. In the United States, for example, 100 years ago, they had 11.5 million farmers. Today, they have just 890,000 farmers, but production volumes increased quite rapidly, and those efficiency figures improved even more rapidly. Just 10 years ago, in the United States, they had 699,000 fax machine workers. So we can guess how many fax machine workers they have right now in the United States. But it's absolutely clear. Some people, because of digitizations, because of artificial intelligence, because of robots, will lose their jobs. And it means we all, on the level of municipalities, regional level, national level, African Union Commission level, European Commission level, but also on business level, we have to take care about those people who will maybe lose their jobs. We have to provide new skills, digital skills to all our people. And yeah, we cannot stop progress. Train is moving. Speed is quite high. And now it's up to us to be on that train, or to just to stay and to wave to leaving train. I don't think this last option is a real option for African people or European people.
To continue on the same issue, you know, I mean, you talk about youth. Mobile technologies and mobile services created in Africa 3.8 million jobs 2 years ago, and that it contributed to the GDP of Africa 6.7%. So yes, some jobs may be lost, more will be created. It calls upon us also, and policymakers and governments, to provide the safety nets for those who are unable to join the digital revolution for whatever reason, but more pressure for e-literacy and digital literacy of our population without discrimination, young, old, women, and men. So this is also to say that it remains a challenge. I mean, digital literacy remains a challenge for Africa that we all have to address. I don't know whether this is also the time to talk about another challenge when it comes to e-governance. We are convinced of e-governance as our main approach and program for Africa when it comes to digitization. One of the challenges, beside connectivity, beside investment, it's the climate, it's the business climate in our countries, as was pointed out by Mr. Sabah. But also, we want to make sure that it's not just about connecting or connections, I mean the infrastructure, the ICT infrastructure. We want to make sure that e-governance also means a dialogue between the governments and the citizens. Otherwise, our citizens will be alienated or they'll have the loyalty to the cyberspace. They're spending more time, on social media probably than what's happening around them in real life. So it can further alienate our citizens from our country. So unless governments engage in a dialogue, virtually or otherwise, with our citizens, there's also the risk of losing this loyalty to, as I said, to a cyber entity, and it could be, about terrorism. It also starts on the cyberspace, among other things. So we want to make sure also that this dialogue exists and that e-governance entails democracy and dialogue between all stakeholders.
Ms. Chinenye, I'd like to also ask you, what do you see is the risk in the digital divide between men and women? We're seeing IT organizations and digital technologies all over the world looking around their development floors and at their employees and wondering, why don't we have more female employees? And why do they want more female employees? Is it to check a box for their diversity portfolio? Or what are the risks of not having more females on the ground and on the floor?
I like to say one of the risks is innovation and creativity. Women, regardless of how you look at it, women, we have a different point of view with how a woman runs the home, she cooks, she cleans, she carries her kids. We're able to multitask and see things from a different point of view. One of the things I believe organizations will lose out with not having women in their field is that you won't have that different point of view, that different innovative ideas. So when you have an organization or a corporation where you have only men in the coming up with creative ideas, how do you have innovative solutions when you don't have women? How do you have people to come up with healthcare solutions? Because a woman knows how, for example, you're running you want to build a maternal app, a maternal healthcare app. You need a woman to tell you these are the challenges we face as women when we are pregnant, when we are going through certain stages in our lives. You need that different point of view, just for the not only for the gender balance, but in having a combined solution, a combined approach. And I won't only talk about the women. I'll talk about the youth too. A lot of times, young people are left out in these situations, in the digital divide. When we leave out young people in the collective solution, we also leave out a set of people with new creative ideas. If you look at the world today, a lot of the new solutions, especially in the tech field, from people under 25. You have the likes of Facebook, Snapchat, they all started this at a very young age. So if the developing nations can have young people being digitally enlightened, being digitally literate, they will also be able to come up with innovative solutions that can address our needs as a developing nation. These are some of the issues, I believe, that come to the risk of digital divide.
So, Your Excellency, Dr. Amani Abu Zaid, you mentioned digital literacy, as did Chinenye, is an important step towards getting the unconnected connected. But cost is also a big, big barrier. a fixed mobile broadband package in, according to ITU studies, costs 64% of the average household income in Africa. That's compared to 1.7% of the average household income in developed countries. So, other than affordability, what fears and challenge do you foresee the work you do with the AU Commission? And how do you plan to overcome those challenges? How do we get these people connected in a meaningful way?
You're right. In Africa, we pay 4 times more for broadband or to access internet than in developed world, which is huge. But investment or this initial cost is not really, in my view, the major or the biggest challenge. Because again, when there's a business opportunity, when there's a good business climate, ICT provides a great opportunity for investment within the continent and from outside the continent. It remains a challenge, yes, but we need to improve also the conditions for these investments to take place in our countries. We need to promote the role of the private sector to come into the sector and help out with the infrastructure. But again, this is about the lack of ICT infrastructure in Africa. There's also the issue of the different levels of development within the continent and whether and how much do they represent an opportunity. If we talk about e-governance, for instance, for a country that doesn't have necessarily a deep-rooted bureaucracy, that's great. It's a wonderful opportunity because you can afford to do the jump. And even this morning, when people were talking about the fragile economies and thinking of it as an impediment, I said, no, this is actually a great opportunity for business. The risk is high, but then the gains would be high as well. This is where you should go, on the contrary. And then you have other countries within the continent, like my own. I come from Egypt, and I cited this example. We have a governance system that existed since the year 3150 BC. So to change that this is a major obstacle. Why? When we talk about e-governance, it's not about creating a new app to the same and all systems and bodies. It will entail the complete change and transformation of our businesses, the business model, the way we do governments operate. So it's not just about doing things through the internet, doing the same things through internet. It's a major and fundamental change, and please, Vice President, correct me if I'm wrong. Is this what you did in your country or not? That would have to take place in order for this e-governance to take place. So in the African Union, we're having different various challenges. One, that Africa is not, we're not talking about one Africa, we're talking about several with different levels of development, IT development, and also different kinds of economies that exist. We have also, as African Union, an additional challenge and an opportunity is to integrate Africa digitally. In terms of, so that's a major task, and we're looking into Europe. We know that not everything in Europe has not been done 100%. It's not necessarily perfect, but we can afford to learn from this experience, to learn from what went well and what didn't go so well. And that's what I'm saying. It's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for us at the African Union, and that's why we're having this partnership, hopefully very soon, to be launched between the EU and the AU on e-governance and among other things.
Okay. Some brief reactions from Mr. Sabag and then Mr. Ansip, and then we'll open up the floor for questions.
The question about cost is very important. Now, there's a good piece of news here, which is that we tend to overestimate the impact of technology in the short term and underestimate its impact in the long term. The technology that we're bringing today is 1/10 of the cost that the technology we had in mind 4 or 5 years ago. So that's really sort of the leapfrogging that we were able to achieve in terms of bringing connectivity solutions to anywhere on the planet. 1/10. Think of it again this way, 1/10. But the cost of the technology itself, just provisioning the service, to go back to the point that was raised earlier by a member of the audience, is not good enough, because we need the environment in which we intend to deploy this technology, to build on your point, to have also the rules of engagement evolve in a manner that it makes it conducive. Because if we keep the modus operandi of the past, it will go away, it will lose its impact. And I will give you an example from our own industry. Probably when our industry started, we needed one controller, one pilot, if you want to think of it, for every satellite. SES has now 55 satellites in orbit. We need 7 controllers, because technology allows us to do things much more efficiently. But we needed to rewrite the books, to rewrite the business processes. And in countries in Africa where this rewriting was done, some of the networks that we have connected, so we work with mobile operators and fixed telecom operators, or both, they were able to double or triple the traffic that they have on their networks in a single year. And this is not for WhatsApps or SMSs or what have you. It's not. It's because it's making a real difference in people's lives. I mean, let me give you a statistic so that you can appreciate why it matters. If you assume, and we had a very important conversation about women, that women do 60% of the work in the world, produce 50% of the food, earn 10% of the income, and has 1% claim on property, okay? And you actually improved, in Africa or any other continent, the conditions of women by providing them with the ability to connect. Think about the multiplier effect. But deploying just the technology on its own won't move the needle. We need the environment to move there. And look, it's not secret sauce. Every year, the World Economic Forum publishes an index by the name of the Network Readiness Index. I developed this index with Professor Sumitra Dutta back in the early 2000s. And somewhere in the mid-2000s, the star of that index was Estonia. It was the case study. Morocco was also part of North Africa, one of sort of the stars emerging, because Morocco, Estonia, and other countries developed a very favorable environment for digitization to become part of the public discourse, whether it's at the policy level, whether it's at the industry level, at the government institution level. And it's in this kind of environment that service providers like us, technology providers, can have an impact. So I wanted to stress this point. It's not this or that. The stars have to be aligned. We know a few things about stars.
Yeah. So in the interest of time, I don't want to eat into our time for discussion on policy, and we've run out of time to discuss challenges. So I'll ask you to hold on to your comments till then. We'll take 2 more audience questions very briefly. Over there.
Thank you very much. My name is Philip, and I'm very interested in where the public and the private sectors talk to each other. Building up on your last point, I want to seize this opportunity and ask both representatives of the private sector, those 2 panelists on the right, now that you have this excellent opportunity to ask representatives of the public sector from both Europe and from Africa, and the plenty of policymakers that are undoubtedly in the room, what are for you the key obstacles that could be removed in the regulatory environment in several African countries so that businesses can thrive, digital startups could scale up better? What would be the legislative changes that you would like to see so that digitalization can really pick up and be benefits for all? Thank you.
You're doing my job and asking the questions I had planned for the next session in policy, especially the public-private partnership. So we will come to that, but it'll be interesting to hear those thoughts when we come to the next session, if that's okay. Yes.
Hi, my name is Hisham. I'm the chairman of the Banking Federation in Egypt. My question is to the panel. How can you encourage the venture capital to play a role on the topic we are discussing today?
Any panelists want to take on venture capitalists and really talking about the challenges? Mr. Ansip?
In this meaning, situation is quite similar in African continent and in the European Union. We know that for startups, it's pretty difficult to scale up here in Europe because this market is fragmented. And if it will stay fragmented, then we will send a very simple message to our startups. Stay at home or go to the United States where there is a single market with 300 million healthy customers. Because for startups in Europe, it's practically impossible to understand about those 28 different regulations and how they are protecting consumers in some countries and what kind of obligations those businesses are getting from those different regulations. So in African continent, exactly the same. I think in Africa, it's possible to avoid repeating the same mistakes we made in our continent. I think already now, in African continent, you have to think about creation of digital single market, common marketplace for African companies, but for also European companies. I mentioned Jumia. For them, it's also quite complicated to understand about those different, very different rules in different countries. So if there will be huge single market in African continent, then it will be really attractive for business angels, for venture capital, and to attract this venture capital, I think you have to start right now with creation of these common markets for African continent.
Okay, I'm being prompted to move on to the next session, I'm sorry. But again, get your phones out. It's time for another interactive poll. So in this session, we'll be talking about policy. We've talked about the opportunities, about the challenges, but now how do we turn those learnings, those experiences into policy that will really drive growth? So my question to you is, do you think that digitalization in developing countries should be driven by 1, the public sector, 2, the private sector, or 3, public-private partnerships? Who do you think digitalization in developing countries should be driven by? Okay, again, that's a resounding, we had guessed that this would be the most popular option, the public-private partnerships, but there is also about 20% of the room that do think that perhaps private sector involvement is important, but it should be driven by the public sector and the government. There's an overly used so-called African proverb, I don't even know if it really is African, that says if you want to go fast, go alone, and if you want to go far, go together. So M-Pesa and iHub, those are 2 Kenyan innovations that have been lauded the world over, and we all know about them, about mobile money and mobile banking. But we know that if Kenya had waited for the government to start these initiatives, well, we'd still be waiting. So we know the private sector is important, it brings speed and innovation, but we know that the public sector and regulations are crucial for sustained, widespread, and equitable scale. So let's start with the private sector, Mr. Sabag. And if you can take the thoughts of Mr. Philip in the audience and his question on board, how can digitization be mainstreamed into development policy, and what should be the role of the private sector in shaping that?
I will answer this question as if I was a magician, so I don't implicate myself. So if I was a magician, I think the policy should be very clear about the priorities of digitization across all facets of the economy or public sector. That needs to be driven top-down. And again, I take the case of Estonia. Estonia was not an accident. The government was very clear that this was a priority. So post-1989, when the government, I think, looked at how we're going to move from where we were to where you want to go 20 or 30 years down the road, digitization was that choice. So everything was wired and geared to enable the private sector to thrive. So we need to start with this sort of foundation. So if I was a magician, the sort of the policy and the regulations have to facilitate this. And then the private sector can come in and make an impact, not just in terms of deploying communication networks, but also in terms of enabling digitization at the level of industries. So to give you an example, and I will conclude on this. So in Italy, part of our infrastructure in space is enabling the network of generating and distributing renewable energy. That's what we do. Now, and what we do is we connect the sensors to provide information that allows a better management of electricity production. Now, take this capability and apply it in Africa, or just in sub-Saharan Africa. In that particular region, every year, 40 billion hours are spent to transport water from point A to point B. That's the same amount of hours of all the workforce in France. Now, if you actually can deploy infrastructure and technology that can enable the better management of this resource, and digitization is an integral part of it, think about the economic impact that can create. We actually ran the numbers. It's for every dollar invested, you will generate $30 of economic value add. So my message is we need to be clear on the policy, both at the level of connectivity, but also policy about the priority sectors that we want to enable through digitization. I think both of them have to come together. And if they're there, I think the private sector has a tremendous role to play.
Okay, so shifting gears a little bit from a magician's hat to a woman, Your Excellency, who's just stepped into a role where this is your job. You know, how will you propose for public-private partnerships to be structured for the AU member nations? And do you see it happening as this magician envisions?
Yes. To come back, maybe just, I'll go back very briefly about the women's perspective. Many of you maybe have been listening to Ms. Amina Mohammed's intervention this morning. Did you see how she, a woman, read EDD? She read it as expected delivery date. Just to give you the perspective of a woman, I mean, a simple for everybody else probably EDD, European Development Days, but just to emphasize the point you just made about a woman's perspective and bringing other points of view to the table. And I want to go back to the question of venture capital, but not just venture capital. For ICT and in any other aspect of innovation in our societies, we need all kinds of instruments. And it's very important to be innovative. Remember, particularly in ICT, these are, well, it's a new business model, as I just mentioned. It's very agile, mainly and mostly around the world by young people. So we need also financial instruments that are very agile and to work together with our young people, or not so young necessarily, in the sector. And venture capital could be one of these instruments. The African Union, I keep saying, well, it's true. I just stepped into my position less than 2 months ago, but I know that already a lot has been done by the African Union into bringing this one digital Africa. We're continuing our advocacy for that. We're working on we already have 1 or 2 projects on e-education and e-medicine across the continent. We're also working on and implemented a project for the internet exchange, a local internet exchange within Africa. So we're trying, and hopefully we'll get there. The public-private partnership is a major cornerstone. Because as I mentioned that we need all kinds of financial instruments, we also need every player. ICT is not, a sector does not exist on its own. It's the backbone of our infrastructure, it's the backbone of all the development. So it exists everywhere, whether people recognize it or not, even though in the African continent, more and more it is recognizable. And I'm happy you just mentioned le Maroc, le plan numérique of Morocco. I can mention also that was also championed by the king. Only last week in Egypt, we also have the president, who is also heading a council for cashless society in less than 1 year. So yes, some of the actions have to come from governments, but also the same governments have to make sure that the private sector operates openly and freely and across border, because we need a one Africa. Our economies remain fragmented, very small, and some are completely different from each other. And funny enough, some are open to, investment from outside the continent, and less open to investments and cooperation from a neighboring country within the continent. So this is also another issue that we are dealing with in Africa.
I'm going to ask the same question to Vice President Ansip, but I'll push a little to ask you, do you envision that there will be one policy, perhaps framed by the European Union, that by the Africa Union, that all member states will adapt a policy on how to integrate ICT into their development? Oh, sorry, Your Excellency, yes. If I can ask you, and then I'll also ask Mr. Ansip also. Do you envision that will happen, and
of
when?
course, I do not envision. I know it's going to happen. We cannot miss it. I know, and there's absolutely no doubt in my mind. But just look at the way things are moving across Africa. I don't know what kind of literature or information you've been getting. Countries are leapfrogging, and I really mean it. It's not just at the sens figuré. I mean, it is happening. The challenge is, or the issue is, that we have these pockets of excellence across the continent. We need to break the silos across the continent for it to happen for all of us. So I know it's happening. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind. And please listen again to some of the leaders who are here in this room, probably this room, earlier this morning, and go see what's happening in the countries. It's fantastic, and I have no doubt. It's hard work. I'm not saying it's going to happen tomorrow and it's going to be easy. This is not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that it's going to happen. Difficult as it is, it's going to happen.
It would be a shame for all those pockets of excellence to not be
Cohesively
connected into a single policy that drives the continent forward.
That's true.
Mr. Ansip, you're, as I said, behind this very important document, Digital for Development, that outlines how digital technologies can be mainstreamed into development policy. So perhaps give us your thoughts on how you're working at the European Commission, and also your thoughts on how the private sector is involved in that kind of policy framework.
I was, of course, surprised how friendly people here in this hall, they believe in public-private partnership projects. I think every player has to play its own role. Public sector will never have that's a big amount of money private sector has, and I will be happy if there will be part also in those digital developments for public-private partnership projects. There is a part also civil society has to play, but once again, all the players, every player, each player has to play its own role. For public sector, I think the most important is to create a predictable regulatory environment. To attract investments, predictability is definitely needed. And in this meaning, I would like to support my fellow commissioner. We really have to deal with e-government solutions. As we know, those e-government solutions, they are much more transparent solutions than those old-fashioned solutions. And transparency, I think it's good for our people, it's good for our businesses, but not everybody will be happy because for corruption, basis is not so fruitful anymore. So e-government solutions, they are inclusive, much more inclusive solutions than those traditional ones. And informed people, they are able to take part in this decision-making process. Even during elections, they can make their informed decision. And of course, those e-government solutions, they are really efficient solutions. So in India, for example, they gave single digital identity to their citizens. And their minister said that thanks to this, they were able to cut all those mediators paying allowances to their citizens, and in this way, they were able to save $8 billion a year. I don't think it's possible to invest into this EID project more than 8 billion years. So those solutions, they can be really beneficial solutions. And for private sector, it's also important to have this single digital identity in the countries guaranteed by the government. Once again, I don't want to provide those examples about Estonia, but in Estonia we implemented those ID cards, and those cards were not used so in such a smart way during the first 6 years. It took 6 years for Estonians to give their first 1 million digital signatures. In the very beginning, to identify yourself when crossing borders, or to open envelopes, for example, it was useful, but not a really smart way to use those smart ID cards. And then we implemented so-called once-only principle on the level of the government. It means state has right to ask for the same information just once from their citizens, from their businesses. Second time is prohibited. State has to remember, and with my permission, to use this information once again. And it gave a real boost on usage of those digital identities, digital signatures in Estonia. Estonia is a small country, but now Estonians are signing digitally more than 1.3 million times per week, and population of Estonia is 1.3 million inhabitants. Many years ago, already we figured out that thanks to digital signatures, we were able to save 1 working week a year, which is equal to 2% of GDP, which is equal to our defense expenditures President Donald Trump is asking for. So we can say that in some countries, defense expenditures are coming just from digital signatures. If it was possible in one country, why not in some other countries? So in the country I know best, in all the public sector, they have to pay 50 million euros for all those public sector digital solutions, including salaries. Finland is a little bit bigger, but they have to invest every year 2 billion euros. Finland is a little bit bigger, not 40 times bigger than Estonia. It's just 4 times bigger. UK, 20 billion euros a year. So once again, a little bit bigger, but not so much bigger. And as we know, in the digital world, everything has to be scalable. If those consumption volumes will increase, then cost per unit have to decrease. But we can see how in some countries, thanks to really efficient e-government solutions, digital identities, people, they can get those services practically free of charge, and how in some other countries they have to pay terribly high price for this. So in this meaning, I think we have to cooperate and promote those e-government solutions also in the African continent. As we know, in some sectors, Africa is much more developed than Europe, talking about mobile payments and M-Pesa and Kenya, for example. Nothing like this here in our continent. So now it's time to deal with e-government solutions.
But again,
welcome.
Oh, hello. Bonjour, pardon.
But again, what you're speaking about, you know, the amazing strides that were taken in Estonia, the examples we give of Kenya, are those simply pockets of excellence? Are they, you know, the perfect storm that happened to happen, or were they a result of a concerted policy by the government or by a union of some kind?
You asked me.
No, I was asking VP, but if you'd like to jump in.
You know, if people, they can enjoy some really efficient, some really user-friendly solutions, then they will get appetite. E-prescriptions, for example. So it's so easy. Elderly people, they don't have to know how it works. Where is this internet in those prescriptions? Where is this E? But it's easy to understand that in cases of chronic diagnosis, you will make just phone call to your general practitioner, family doctor, and then you will get those pharmaceuticals showing your ID card from every drugstore. It's beneficial. And of course, then people will say, how did you call it? E-prescription. I would like to get this E. And they would like to get those internet-based e-services from all the state institutions, from all the private companies. So providing some of those really user-friendly solutions, we can put under the pressure all the other service providers, which is good for our people.
Talk about M-Pesa and other solutions, not necessarily from the government side. On the contrary, we take pride on how creative and innovative our private sector and our people are in the continent. You see, for instance, I was just reading this article about EcoBank in West Africa, and how, after seeing what's happening with mobile payments and mobile money in Orange and other companies, now they are starting their own virtual or e-banks. And another thing that I think is going to be very important from our perspective, which it's within my portfolio, by the way, is postal services. How do we transform postal services from the traditional role, which is practically obsolete now? Now they're turning into providing financial services, which is something it started to happen also in Africa. So some are government-led, you're right, but many are private sector-led. And I must also say that even when we talk about SMEs in Africa, one has to be very cautious, because many of these SMEs are not formal. Remember that in our economies in Africa, many of our businesses are conducted informally in the informal sector. So one of the uses also, or the benefits of digitization, is to ensure that this inclusion is happening informal to more formalized economy, without losing necessarily the dynamism and agility of the informal sector.
I've been told there isn't time for questions, but I'm going to take one question from a woman. Yes, there. In the back.
Thank you very much. Julia Ślińska with Nokia. And it's very interesting that we are having discussion about this public and private partnership, but there is another partnership which is needed, because digitalization now is not just about ICT, it's actually how we improve other sectors, being healthcare or education, with ICT, which means that it's not only for the ministers of ICT or of digitalization, but it requires cooperation within the governments. And so I know more or less how it is happening in Europe, being here, but I'm very interested to hear how African Union is approaching that. Do you have a strategy to start this collaboration, to create a project between different departments to move digitalization forward, to change the policies and regulations to make it possible?
As I just mentioned, shall I? Mm-hmm. I did mention probably the ICT being backbone of infrastructure, and this is how our strategy in Africa, within the Africa strategy formulated by the African Union, which we call Agenda 2063. So the view is that ICT is the backbone of development and the backbone of our approach. So the African Union is cognizant of the role of IT not as a sector, rather as a backbone for all the work that we do. Now, strategy is one thing, operationalizing and implementing the strategy is something else. And that's where the real challenge lies. And this is, you know, my earlier comments about how to implement this in all the countries that constitute Africa, knowing that they're very diverse in terms of either their economies, either of the IT infrastructure that's available, the openness of their economies for investment on digital literacy, and so on and so forth.
Mr. De Croo, how was lunch with the Queen?
Lunch with the Queen was nice, but especially with the SDG advocates, it was a good crowd.
Okay, we'll come back to you for some 5 minutes of your input before the closing remarks. But I'd also like to give each of the panelists just a brief 30 seconds opportunity to give your closing remarks, what you'd like to leave the audience with, and what you'd like to leave EDD with before we meet again next year and discuss where we are. Start with you, Mr. Sabag, sorry.
Okay. Look, my remark is my takeaway from the comments from my fellow panelists, which digitization has to start with a top-down agenda. It cannot happen just bottom-up from the private sector. Otherwise, we'll be missing too many pieces. Two, within every continent, and here we're discussing Africa, there are a number of case studies, very positive case studies that we can build on. We don't need to reinvent the wheel, but we can use these case studies to leapfrog. And three is, we've heard many cases of technologies that were deployed that digitize either a communication network or industries connected to that network. And they literally transformed lives. And the reason why I'm saying this is that when we think about the top-down agenda, it's not just about ICT and connectivity, it's also about how do we transform the sectors. M-Pesa didn't happen because a telecom operator just had the idea and the financing. It first and foremost required that the banking regulations would allow such a service to be rolled out. And the reason why it was harder to roll it out in other countries in Africa and around the world was not because of the application or the telecom network, it's because banking regulations were not ready to do that. And we see this in our industry day in, day out. The one thing I want to leave you with is every single day, we provide content to 1.4 billion people on this planet. So whenever one of the 1.4 billion individuals on this planet sits in front of a TV or an iPhone and they watch a content, it's through the SES infrastructure. The only reason why we were able to do that, I mean, there are many reasons, but the single most important one was that we had market access. And the way we developed this model was in Europe. It was a single digital market, and we were able to bring that signal there. And there's still part of the world today where we cannot do that because the regulation doesn't allow us. So my wish as a magician is to have market access.
Market access. Chinenya?
For me, we need to include women, girls, and youths in the developmental process for digitization. This comes in terms of policy, in terms of access, internet access, especially to women and girls in the rural areas. We talk about development, we talk about digitalization, we talk about e-commerce, but if the people in the rural areas, most especially, don't have access to the internet, and in terms of access, I mean cheap and affordable internet access, how do they become a part of the digitalization and developmental process? Also, in terms of policy, I believe the public and private sector have a role to play. Oftentimes, and presently, digitization is ahead of policy. So you see a new product coming out, you see new features. We're talking about Bitcoin now. And in many countries, you don't have regulatory policies around this area. So you see investments being delayed or people having being double-minded in terms of investment because there's no regulatory policy to promote these markets. So the government and the private sector have to work together. The government has to take the inclusion of the youths and women, because in the next few years, you're going to have the youths taking up these government positions. If they are not digitally equipped if they don't have the right skills, if they don't have the right knowledge, how they achieve how they get the knowledge to be able to implement these features in their countries. So this is just my take in this. Thank you.
Thank you. My advice to our citizens, it doesn't matter. Citizens in African continent or in European continent is please push your government under the pressure. Ask for those very efficient and transparent and inclusive e-government solutions. It can be really beneficial. Once again, about Nigeria, I know that just because of implementing this single bank account system in their tax department, they were able to save $2 billion a year. Huge amount of money. I don't know how much they had to invest to get to this solution, but nothing to compare with those 2 billion euros. I know some guys is sitting also here in this room who are able to create that kind of systems. And my advice to governments, once again, it doesn't matter. In Europe, in African continent, is please try to create a really predictable regulatory environment. There is a lot of money in bank accounts here in Europe, but those investors are afraid to make their investments. Without predictability, no investments. Just one mobile operator invested last year on African continent, 1 billion euros. Huge amount of money. But it can be much bigger if in some countries in African continent there will be more predictable business environment. Thank you.
Yes, Africa is home of the next big revolution in ICT. It's a great business opportunity. There are lots of challenges that we are all addressing, but we know that we are going to overcome these challenges. One of them is definitely promoting a harmonized, consistent policy across the continent for IT and other sectors, not just IT, and also creating the right and investment climate to attract investments from within the continent, our private resources and domestic resources, but also international resources. And I'm inviting everybody to contemplate and think of that, given the dynamism and vitality of our young people and the great work that's being done in so many African countries and the commitment from many African leaders to ICT and e-governance solutions.
Mr. De Croo?
Well, I'm supposed to be making the closing remarks on a panel that I only listened to the last part of. So let me maybe just look at it more in general. I think related to digital and development, we've come quite some way over the last year on the European setting. It is now the consensus that we signed this morning. The digital element is really clearly stated in that. The Commission is now working on a staff working document to see how to implement the digital dimension in the Commission's policy, and all that is good. Of course, I think we should know that digital is never a goal in itself. I mean, technology is a tool. It's a tool to be used, but to be used for a few elements which I think were a bit the weak spots in development up to now. One of them is data. This is a world where it is incredibly difficult to have data which is accurate, and to have data which is somewhat related to the state of today. And so using technology is a great opportunity for providing data. Why is data so important? First of all, to justify the interventions that we do. Too often, I think, in the development world, up to now, it was often based on gut feeling, on ideology, and often this was giving the good direction, but is it really focusing where we really have the need? Not especially. Third element, why data is so important, is to measure impact. And measuring impact was really, really the difficult element, in such a way that up to now, in the development world, there was one measure, and that measure was how much you spend. The more you spend, the better of a development agency or the better of a minister you are, which is a bit strange because in most of the other political domains, it's the other way around. And so being able to finally have the data to measure where intervention is needed and what the impact is of that intervention, that I think for me really is the big promise, besides breaking barriers, fighting corruption, and so on, which I think are the known ones. The interesting thing is that in that domain, using data to measure, you really have an opportunity for leapfrogging, and for leapfrogging and bringing certain experiences actually back here. I have an interesting example on something we are doing in Uganda today, together with a Belgian company, but that is mostly active in Africa, on using the data of mobile operators to, and that's their commercial work, is doing work for the mobile operators. Now they have a data for good part, which is basically using mobile data to try to identify where poverty really is, so really be precise on it. And we are doing this project together with them. Now, in one of the meetings, what came out was to say, well, this is really interesting, but why are we not doing it here? I mean, why are we not using the data of our mobile operators here to identify where poverty really is? Because actually we have the same question to a different degree, but the question is still there. So that for me, on a broader scale, is a real promise, is that globalization is finally getting real. I think up to now, globalization was a one-way street. It was mostly things developed in the Western world and being consumed in the rest of the world. This is changing. If you look at mobile payments, the place where it is happening today, it's not here, it's in Rwanda, it's in Bangladesh, it's in Kenya. If you look at distant healthcare, it is not happening here because we have all kind of regulation making it difficult, but it's happening in Tanzania, Rwanda, and so on. And that is a great promise, is that globalization finally is getting its full breadth. It is really going in all directions. It is going to push everyone to be on the top of their toes, but that I think is a great thing. And of course, it's a bit a contradiction that now that globalization finally is delivering its promise, that some people are starting to doubt on it. But I would say there's a saying in French, where you say it's reculer pour mieux sauter, which basically means sometimes you need to take a few step backs, and then it's easier to jump higher or further than that. The last element is in any technological revolution, and this definitely is one, next to the technological revolution, there's always an educational revolution. It's always happened that way. When we had the industrialization, the educational component of it was getting everyone into primary and secondary school. Why was that? Well, because we needed the labor force. Yeah. And in the 60s, the educational revolution was pushing everyone into higher education. Why is that? Because we needed the brain power. So the question is, in this fourth industrial revolution, which is taking place all over the world, what's the educational component to that today? I think for the Western world, it is continuous education, making sure that people continue to get schooling, making sure that learning something is not something that stops the moment you leave the classroom. But there as well, I think there is an opportunity for leapfrogging in education. And that opportunity is in our partner countries. And there I would say we need to aim high. I mean, the goal cannot be to use technology just merely to make sure that the teacher is in the class and that the kids are getting into the class. This is maybe the basic element, but if we are growing into a highly developed, highly technological world, it is also going to be the case in, for example, our African partner countries. If we want those countries to play a role in manufacturing at some point, it is going to be high-tech manufacturing. It's not going to be low-technology manufacturing. I think low-technology manufacturing is gone in any case. So if we make the choices in education, I would try to make sure that we aim high enough and that we use technology for that. You might have understood that I'm an optimist on technology, and I think we should, because I think technology is really improving our lives. But policy is important. Policy is important, as has been said, to make sure that it's inclusive, to make sure that our civil rights and liberties are being safeguarded. And there I am scared. Every day I hear politicians saying, if we need to break the rules of human rights to fight terrorism, we should do it. That scares the hell out of me, what I'm hearing that, and I think it's a topic around the world. But in the end, it's all about attitude. What's our attitude towards technology? Do we see it as something that we can shape and that is an opportunity, or do we see it as something that is happening to us? If you see it that way, you only are going to see the negatives, or I think the positives are really the ones we should get. Thank you.
Thank you. So this debate on digitalization has highlighted to us the huge opportunities that digital access can bring to developing countries. However, there are risks, there are challenges, and there are barriers. And we've learned that we must work together and learn from one another in order to overcome them. So the role of digital technologies and services in EU development policy was first recognized as in a Commission communication in 2011, stating their relevance as enablers of socio-economic progress. It has been 6 years since that conversation started. Our debate today has opened an opportunity for the EU to reevaluate and perhaps re-strategize and restructure development policy priorities with a digital lens for access, for growth, for job creation, a reduction of poverty, social transformation, and gender equality. I'd like to say a big thank you to our panelists as well as the audience for making this a lively and insightful debate. Thank you very much.